My name is Dario Hasenstab. I have 2 degrees in international affairs, and I'm here with Balder Hagritz, a former university professor of mine, as well as an IR consultant. And together, we're bursting the Western bubble. Today, we will analyze the reporting on the war in Iraq through the lens of the Western bubble, because while Western societies have many strengths and significant weaknesses, in order to analyze these, we use the concept of the Western bubble. If you would like to know more about this concept, how this podcast started, or who we are, make sure to listen to our introduction episode. Now that we are in August, we are continuing with our summer episodes to kind of bring you a different vibe to the beach, mountains, or wherever you're listening to this episode. In the next 3 episodes, we will highlight some developments that show the already existing process of the bursting of the Western bubble. Hi, Balder. Why are we speaking about this topic for our summer episode? Why are we speaking about this particular press team covering the Iraq war?
Hello, Dario. Directly, the reason is that there was an article written in March of this year by a US reporter who actually went in the other direction. We know that during the War on Terror from 2001 onwards, and specifically with respect to the war in Iraq, there was a tendency for Western media, certainly US media, to be too comfortable in reporting official discourse, official statements by the United States government, by the Pentagon, in favor of invading Iraq, and there was not enough critical perspectives, critical analysis, critical journalism looking at the underlying dynamics. And there were, fortunately, a few journalists who ducked that trend, who actually did critically report on the United States government and their approach to Iraq. And this article was written by one of those people, and that is a good text to analyze to see what the media has to be careful of in these situations.
So, the text that we're talking about is titled Why the Press Failed on Iraq, and it was published in Foreign Affairs magazine by John Walcott on March 19th of this year. And in this article, John Walcott writes about his time at Knight Ridder, a former US media outlet, and their coverage of the build-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. In this piece, he criticizes his colleagues from other outlets, which sometimes blindly published stories given to them by officials high up in the chain, pushing for war with Iraq despite a lack of clear evidence of Iraq's involvement in the 9/11 attacks. Furthermore, Walcott writes about the fact that basic rules of journalism could have prevented outlets such as the New York Times from supporting the Bush administration's agenda on removing Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein, something that the New York Times actually then later apologized for their coverage on the build-up to the war in Iraq.
Which we discussed in another episode a little bit already, and the media episode, I believe this was. And the problem with that was that the apology was too little too late. 3 years later, when the whole country is fed up with the consequences of the war in Iraq, to then publish an article saying, hey, we got it wrong. Well, yeah, but you as a journalist, you as a media outlet, are supposed to actually report while it's happening. You're supposed to be the ones critically assessing whether the government is abusing their power or not. And an apology later is fine, it's just a little bit useless, right? So, in that sense, it's much more interesting to see how these things happened. How come that the United States media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, were so comfortable in playing their part in creating these phony narratives justifying a horrendous war, and try to implement that for the future to make sure that it doesn't happen again. As such, this article written by Walcott is very useful and very timely, because you can see now in 2023 that these same destructive dynamics in the media are still occurring. That the lessons haven't really been learned despite official apologies by the New York Times and others.
And we have discussed these destructive dynamics before in season one in our episode on the media in general, which I encourage all the listeners to listen to if you haven't already. And it's really interesting to see how the dynamics we discussed back then are 100% applying to Walcott's colleagues in this case study of the invasion of Iraq. You know, something like being like journalists being too close to politicians or to officials, having a too close relationship, because that maybe will enable or ensure that they will receive bits and pieces of information that they can then publish. Um, but you know, politicians knowing this and playing the game, knowing that if they feed this one journalist a certain piece of information, that they will also run the story in, you know, a positive way for them.
Yeah, and it's a complex world, right? Being a journalist is not easy. So in an ideal theoretical scenario, which will never be possible in the real world, journalists are pure critical hawks of government policy. They critically assess government policy. They try to uncover abuse, corruption, and they do not play any governmental game. They are a watchdog for the country to make sure that the government doesn't overreach. That's the ideal scenario. By the way, on a side note, that also means that they should be much more worried about the government rather than the opposition, because you see nowadays that there's a little bit of a tendency by journalists to treat both political sides equally. Democrats versus Republicans, left versus right, whatever. But that's not what they're supposed to do. The opposition is much less interesting than the government. It's about the government, whoever is in government, being critically assessed. And you see now with Biden, for example, that the US media is much more comfortable with the Biden administration than the Trump administration before. And as a result, they give the Biden administration much easier time. Well, that's not what you want. You want them to go after the Biden administration because that's what journalists are supposed to do. Now, um, that ideal scenario is never going to happen anyway because journalists have a complex reality to deal with. First of all, they're also human beings. So when 9/11 happens, they are part of the patriotic wave that hits the United States, right? When COVID happens, they're part of the fearful masses that are scared that they or their parents or their grandparents are going to die. They are human beings. They are not rational robots that just calculate everything. They're part of these sweeping societal movements. And it's quite difficult for journalists to step out of that and say, I'm not going to support my country fighting Saddam Hussein. I'm going to critically assess my country. That's very tricky. And then there is the issue that if you as a journalist want to report on the government, you need to have some kind of access to the government. And if you are seen as just someone who rants about the government and works to expose weaknesses and abuse and corruption within the government is not going to give you any access. You still need those interviews. You still need to be able to get close to civil servants. You still need to have politicians who, off the record, tell you things. And that is very, very difficult if you're just seen as a critical um, opposition to government power.
And this was one of the very interesting things from this article, where Walcott describes that, especially the you know the team around him, so the Washington team of the Knight Ridder, that they didn't necessarily see themselves as part of the Washington elite, and that they didn't necessarily want to become kind of part of that group. And there's a lovely quote in the right about the middle of the article, where he says, and I quote, "I was spending meeting time, kind of still meeting unnamed sources in the paint aisles of the Lowe's store and the Cracker Barrel out in Manassas, Virginia, rather than at embassy parties in Washington." End quote. So, you know, I mean, because exactly those high ranking officials, you will meet them at an embassy party in Washington and they will feed you their story. However, those lower ranking officials, let's say an intelligence officer who's seriously doubting the spin and the story that the higher up ranking officials are creating, yeah, exactly. You will not meet them at these parties in Washington, but you will meet them by being that local journalist who really gets his hands dirty in that sense.
And you don't have the psychological and sociological problem with them that you would have with more high ranking ones. So if you if you get your information from high ranking ones, there is a give and take between you and them. You're dependent on them and they're dependent on you in some ways. And so your dynamic as a journalist is very different with them. Whereas low ranking ones probably just do it out of a real personal concern that they talk to you. They don't want anything from you except for you to publish or to report their truth, the way they understand the truth to be, right? Whereas the high ranking ones have a political agenda, and if you don't form part of that agenda, you're going to be ousted from that circle. And I can't emphasize enough. I've never been really part of it myself because as an outside consultant and analyst, I've never really been part of those circles, but I've seen it from up close how powerful the idea is of being part of the in crowd. As a journalist, to be included in the dinners with the president or with the prime minister or with high ranking officials, and how good that makes you feel, and also how much it helps your career. Because if you can quote these people, your editor is going to be very happy with you. So you very easily turn into that inner circle. And once you're part of that inner circle, you can no longer fulfill your journalistic duty. And so it's a very, very difficult balance to find between, yes, still have access, still not be seen as the enemy, but not be too comfortable with them in a way that you can no longer think for yourself and analyze the situation as a true journalist rather than someone who's part of the elite.
And he's saying exactly this in the article as well. And I quote, "Our reporting might have been getting under official skin, but it did not slow the administration's march to war." End quote. Which, I mean, that's unfortunate that there's the journalist telling the truth and then the officials just ignore it. But you have to be willing to be unpopular among these officials. And this even makes you unpopular within your own media outlet sometimes. So the way I understand is that Knight Ridder is that this was an overall media outlet, basically representing a bunch of different local newspapers, and that the Washington bureau would then basically create a story, and then the local papers could choose to run with it, which during that time apparently a few times actually didn't happen, where some of the editors of local papers, they decided to not run with that critical story on Washington is being evil and that they're planning a war against Iraq as a response to 9/11, despite it not making sense. And they actually chose to run with the stories of the Times or the Washington Post instead.
Because that is the safe thing to do institutionally, right? It is very dangerous to go against the grain, to go against the elite powers that be, because there might be consequences. There might even be very direct consequences, such as lawsuits. But there could be more subtle consequences of people no longer inviting you to dinner, people not offering you contracts, advertisers moving away from you. There are very, very serious consequences to be a critical journalist or to be a critical editor. And editors have to report to their bosses. Their bosses are quite likely close to high ranking people in Washington. And there again, you get that very, very dodgy, difficult circle to break through.
Or in general, also your audience. I mean, so when we talk about local papers, let's say there's a local paper somewhere in Iowa, where the sentiment towards the Bush administration after the 9/11 attacks, us versus them, might be very much like, yes, let's get those damn terrorists, with people who are not necessarily capable of having that IR analysis that's required to understand this. And then and then if then one your local paper says, well, Bush is going to the wrong country, I'm not sure how well that's going to go over with your local audience.
Indeed, and so here you've got your audience, you've got your own editor and your own publisher, and you've got the powers that be in Washington and elsewhere, all pushing you towards being very careful in criticizing your own country. On the other hand, it's really, really easy and basically free, nobody cares if you're wrong, to publish some story about Saddam Hussein being evil or weapons of mass destruction existing in Iraq. If you're wrong, everyone will have forgotten. If you're right, you will have just been part of the patriotic fervor that is gripping the country and everyone is happy with you. So basically, the cost benefit analysis of critically going after your own government is very different from the cost benefit analysis of critically going after a foreign dictator. And the consequence, we can't forget about the consequence of that. The consequence is that you had a media establishment with only very few exceptions. One of those exceptions being the people written about in this article. You've got a media establishment that became a party in a completely phony justification for war. The Bush administration, as the article also says, decided already in 2001 we want to make Iraq part of this. They wanted to go after Saddam Hussein, not because he had anything to do with 9/11, but because of other reasons that we've discussed in other episodes. Um, and from that moment on, they needed the media to basically soften the ground, to let the American people know that this was the right thing to do. If the media had taken a different approach, if the media in general had been critical, it would have been much less likely that the United States would have gone to war in Iraq. And as a result, the United States and its people right now in 2023 would be way better off because the war weakened the United States. Not mentioning the horrible destruction that it caused in Iraq and the Middle East, of course.
See, part of that cost benefit analysis of the journalist in that moment, whether to run with that story or not, um, I like the way that Walcott, so John Walcott, he justified, or basically, yeah, to his own team of why they're running with the critical story. And I quote, "We report for the people whose sons and daughters and husbands and wives get sent to war, not for the people who sent them," end quote. And I think that's good, right? You want to have your journalist removed from the people in power and actually report, being that fourth estate and actually holding those officials accountable and reporting for the people who are being sent to war.
This is so important to realize, and unfortunately, not enough people do so. It is incredibly patriotic, it's incredibly supportive of your country to critically assess your government. Not to create conspiracy theories or anything like that, but to criticize your own country, your own government, is the most patriotic thing that you can do. It's unfortunately our human psychological fragility leads us to think that it's more patriotic to criticize Saddam Hussein, or to criticize Gaddafi, or to criticize Xi Jinping in China, or Vladimir Putin in Moscow, because that fulfills this, if you like, Western bubble narrative of we are the good guys, they're the bad guys. But that doesn't help your country. That doesn't strengthen your country. What strengthens your country, what makes the United States better and stronger and more successful, is not going after those foreign dictators, it is going after your own government and making sure that your own government stays honest, that your own government plays within the rules that you as a society have set up.
You already mentioned the fact that, I mean, this was obviously incredibly damaging in 2003 for the United States, more so for the people in Iraq, and then how, because there was no process of the country going through this realization, we messed up here. I mean, we mentioned the New York Times kind of published an apology letter somewhere, very, on the later pages in their own newspaper. Um, but it happened again, as you said. And interestingly, Walcott, so the author of this article, he basically saw the same dynamics happening with the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, when he was writing an article 2 months before the withdrawal saying that, hello, this might be really difficult if we withdraw this quickly because there's still a lot of Afghans who have helped us and are now at the threat of basically the Taliban taking revenge. We do not yet have the capacities, we do not yet have the processes to take these Afghans into the United States. And if we withdraw very quickly, we might see a quick humanitarian political disaster because the Afghan government is not as strong as we think it is. So you have the same criticism there. However, the system didn't learn from it. And then, I mean, I'm pretty sure that the images of that withdrawal in Afghanistan are still very present within our listeners' minds.
And it's very unfortunately understandable and clear to see why this keeps on happening over and over and over again. Essentially, if you really want to fulfill your journalistic duty, you're going to do things that are likely that are going to get you fired. You're going to be unpopular. You're not going to go high in the, with respect to promotion, career wise. Uh, it is not a rewarding process to do your journalistic duty. It is much more rewarding to play the game and uh, satisfy the powers above you, as well as you rightly pointed out, your readers who want to hear the good news about your country, who want to have the superficial kind of analysis, and who don't appreciate their country being criticized. And so it's very difficult to see drastic changes because these are such powerful forces. And yet we still rely on those few journalists that actually go in the other direction, right? And we should celebrate uh, those journalists that don't get to be senior editor of the New York Times, because once you become senior editor of New York Times, chances are that you've been corrupted by the process. We should celebrate those journalists that got fired for their reporting. Unfortunately, we don't do that enough.
Well, but that's what we're doing in this episode, and as part of our, like positive August. Well, trying to be a little bit positive. It's very difficult within the Western bubble context, but at least here we have a journalist who reported on this critically. And I mean, publishing an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine, at least in the world of international relations, that's a big deal. So at least there's something positive happening here, and maybe the bubble is bursting a little bit.
Maybe, and it should be pointed out though that this was mostly focused on something that happened 20 years ago. Yeah, and 21, 22 years ago. And that makes it easier for Foreign Affairs to publish this, right? It would have been interesting to see that same article being written, for example, with respect to Ukraine and Russia at the moment. But Foreign Affairs wouldn't publish this because Foreign Affairs still very much is in that bubble right now. 20 years from now, I look forward to an article in 2043 about how reporters on Ukraine and Russia were also silenced by the system, and some apology from Foreign Affairs and the New York Times coming out about that.
Well, I tried to end it on a positive note, but unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. And this is it with today's summer episode, which we will continue throughout August. And in September, we will start our third season. Please continue to send us requests for topics you'd like for us to analyze then. We will be grateful for your feedback to this format and for questions that you can submit to thewesternbubble@gmail.com. Next week, we will talk about the United Nations being asked by Muslim nations to report on Quran burnings in Sweden and Denmark. Thank you very much for listening, and we will talk to you next week.